So, Hari Om everybody, and welcome to this session 6 of Living Through the Gita. And today we're going to be talking on chapter number 5. So, just to remind you that, this idea of these talks is that I will give you a presentation on a chapter. And it may seem like a lot of stuff which is being given out. The idea is not to kind of absorb everything in one go, because it's impossible to kind of even contemplate on what Lord Krishna is telling Arjuna chapter by chapter in just 1 hour or so. The idea here is that I will do the presentation. I will kind of construct it in the way in which I feel that gives the greatest clarity in terms of the sections, the flow of thought which is there, the connection with the previous chapters, and so on. And it is then for you to take this material to think through some of the ideas which I have presented, and in reference to the original commentary by Pujya Gurudev. You read through that commentary and then you listen to the talk, and you listen to the talk and read the commentary, so that you got 1 month of contemplating on each chapter. Not only the contemplation, but I also give you the ways in which you can begin to practice some of the ideas which are being given here. So it may seem like a lot of material, but I think this is a good way of going about it. And we can go chapter by chapter, and the rest is up to you, because it's not for me to kind of completely give you everything in 1.5 hours. It is an impossible thing to do. The other option is that I can, spread out one chapter over 4 months. Unfortunately, it doesn't serve any purpose, because then it will take about 20 years for me to finish this. And I don't have that kind of capacity and stamina to go over 20 years presenting in this kind of way. But I think there is a part in which you have to play to understand, to practice, to contemplate again and again. Shravanam is one of the main things for us as seekers. Shravanam followed by Mananam, and Mananam followed by Nididhyasanam, which is that you have to practice this thing. I'm spending a few minutes here because I feel that one of two of you have kind of thought that this is too much stuff, and it is kind of going over the head. But that is not the point. The point is, this is just a presentation of the structure of the flow of thought and the verses and how they are constructed together beautifully by Lord Krishna. And this is the materials, then is the basis for you to then do further contemplation. So please remember that. And with that, I'm going to now share the screen with you so that you can see the slides. Okay, everybody can see the slides? Okay, so as I was saying, this is session number 6 and chapter number 5, and it is about true renunciation. And here we are going to contemplate on what Arjuna is asking Lord Krishna. He's saying, there is Karma Yoga and there's Karma Sannyasa. Tell me which one is better. And Lord Krishna then begins to talk about the difference between these two things and how do they fit into the overall thought process of the Bhagavad Gita, the philosophy of the Bhagavad Gita, and the practice which is contained in these verses. So this is what we are going to kind of think about. And the themes in chapter number 5, what I'm going to talk about is, first of all, to kind of give us the logic and the flow of thought so far, because I think it's important to keep on thinking about the continuity, because sometimes that disappears when we are looking at individual verses. And then the Arjuna's question. And is he asking the same question again? Remember that he was asking something similar in chapter number 3. And Does it mean that Arjuna was not listening, or is he asking something else? So here we will analyze that question first of all, and there's a huge commentary which has been written by Shankaracharya on this particular question itself. And then Bhagwan's response. The nature of Samkhya, Karma, Yoga, and Karma Sannyasa. From 6 and 7, we see the method of becoming Brahmanishta, the nature of Jnana-nishta, which is slightly different from Brahmanishta. And this is described in verse number 8 and 9. We look at Karma Yoga and the spectrum of sadhaka-s. So this again gives us an overview of what Lord Krishna is telling us, that there are various points of entry according to our own spiritual development of purification, and where we stand in this whole spectrum, we can then contemplate about, this is my point of entry. And then the difference between a jnani and an atmavit. So atmavit is a person of realization, and this term is in the Bhagavad Gita and in the commentary, and I'm going to use that to kind of understand really what Lord Krishna is making this distinction, and what are the nature and the characteristics of these two categories of thought. And there's quite a large section on that as well. And the basis of meditation. So before chapter number 6, and this is what we have seen throughout the Bhagavad Gita, is that Lord Krishna, right at the end of the previous chapter, he gives us an introduction about the next chapter. And in this case, because chapter number 6 is about meditation, he gives us a couple of verses on the meditation and starting to think about that. And of course, what will you do yourself now in terms of the homework? So let's start with the logic and the flow of thought so far. And if you remember what we discussed right at the very beginning, is to understand the overall structure of the Bhagavad Gita, the flow of thought, the setting of the teaching as well. And then session number 2, we looked at Arjuna's condition, the stress of Arjuna, who ends up by saying, I don't want to fight. Bhagwan's response in terms of the overview of the guidance in chapter number 2 as well. And we saw in session number 3, Bhagwan's detailed response and the overall teaching. He talks about Samkhya Yoga, he talks about Karma Yoga, and he talks about the outcome of this whole kind of development of the seeker, as to which pathway he needs to follow, and what is the final result of that, is this person of perfection who is totally established in the truth, in the knowledge of the self. And then session number 4, we looked at Karma Yoga in detail, whereby the nature of action and the cosmic dimension of action, which is yajna, sacrifice, which then Lord Krishna brings it right down to the level of the individual, and what it means by describing to us 12 different sacrifices and how that relates to our spiritual life, and how we can practice it in order to attain the purification which is going to be given to us by Karma Yoga. How to perform action, and who is the enemy within the desire. And that, of course, was the beginning of chapter number 4, whereby it is about action, knowledge, and also, in a sense, that how these two things are related together. And relationship between action and knowledge, which then takes us in terms of the renunciation of action and knowledge, which we talked about in the last session. And here it is the first verses within which Lord Krishna declares himself. The revelation of divine reveals that he is of divine nature, his incarnation. And the purpose of this incarnation, which he describes, and he talks about this ancient parampara. And Guru Purnima is coming up, and this is something which, which is very much relevant to what Lord Krishna was talking about, the parampara, which he himself started, through which the knowledge has been transmitted. Establishment of dharma, protection of the good, destruction of the evil. This is his stated purpose in the Bhagavad Gita. And of course, Arjuna then becomes the instrument through which this delivery is going to be made in terms of how dharma is going to be restored. And if we think as a major kind of overview of the Bhagavad Gita, it is about establishing ourselves individually in the dharmic way. So action, knowledge, and the relationship to the divine is also mentioned in chapter number 4, holistic method of self-development and enlightenment, Karma Yoga, Bhakti Yoga, Saguna Upasana, which is Bhakti Yoga, which naturally go together because dedication of action cannot take place unless we have this devotion towards the Lord in the Saguna form. And this is Saguna Upasana, which comes later on as a full chapter in itself. Then Jnana Yoga, which is the Nirguna Dhyanam, whereby we begin to go beyond the name and the form to that which is the nameless and the formless. So remember, this is chapter which is dealing with right action, wrong action, inaction. And if you remember this particular diagram, which gives us a relationship between action and actionlessness, because it is important to understand this actionlessness, which is coming from a particular standpoint, in this case, the absolute standpoint, and the self or the Atman is the non-doer. It is without any action. It is inaction, and this is related to the action which is carried out at the individual level by the ego identity, and this is a relative standpoint. And the relationship between the individual relative standpoint and the absolute standpoint, where we find the absolute truth, is that through right action, right knowledge, right belief, right attitude, right intention, which is given to us in chapter number 4, 16 and 17, that we can make this transcendence from our individual identity towards that is the truth about ourselves. So this transcendence has got a way in which it is going to be done, and Bhagavad Gita is, throughout its knowledge and philosophy, is pointing us in this direction. How to take right action in the world, how to have the right knowledge, what is the right knowledge, what is the right belief, attitude, and intention to be changing within ourselves through our sadhana, so that we can to ascend to that which is our true nature. And continuing in one verse, of course, Bhagwan, in his beautiful, wonderful manner of teaching, brings together the concept of action, knowledge, and renunciation. And this is the famous food prayer. And this is what we chant every day before the food, just to remind ourselves that really what we are talking about is this central concept in the Bhagavad Gita, that action, knowledge, and renunciation come together in our day-to-day life in this simple manner of saying the food prayer. And we begin to contemplate on the deeper meaning of this verse, then we understand what this spiritual teaching is all about. Brahman is the oblation, Brahman is the clarified butter, Brahman is the offering, Brahman is the oblation poured into the fire of Brahman. And Brahman shall veritably reach by him who has always sees Brahman in all actions. Someone who always sees Brahman in all the actions has lifted himself out of this ego individuality into this transcendental knowledge of Brahman, and therefore, right at the individual level, these three things come together in this one verse, the most beautiful way of expressing this idea. And then action as sacrifice in the highest knowledge. Bhagwan gives 12 different sacrifices carried out by the yogi and the seeker. And this yajna, which is carried out at the level of the body and the mind and the intellect, he describes many different sacrifices or practices which can be carried out by the yogi and the seeker. But at the heart of this understanding of yajna is what? It is, in a way, it is a sacrifice of the me and the mind into the fire of knowledge. That when my individuality is going to be diminished and purified through this fire of knowledge, then I begin to move towards the ultimate destination of my spiritual pathway. So yajna can be seen at the level of the body. For example, breathing in, breathing out, a very simple way of just looking at this yajna, whereby the incoming breath is offered into the outgoing breath and the outgoing breath is offered into the incoming breath. So imagine just a simple exercise which we are normally doing on a day-to-day basis because we are breathing all the time. And if you bring this knowledge right up to this process which is going on every day, we are in spirituality all the time. See how wonderful the teaching is. And sacrifice, Gurudev says, is a way of being and working in the world in thought, word, and deed, immersed in knowledge. If you can just remember this word sacrifice, remind ourselves again and again throughout the day that this is a way of being in the world and working in the world. And what is at the core of that is the knowledge. To have this knowledge and work in the world in thought, word, and deed, we are actually practicing spirituality according to this highest manner. And then knowledge sacrifice, Lord Krishna says, is the highest. Jnana yajna is superior to dravya yajna. And he says, then all actions culminate in knowledge of the divine self when we do jnana yajna. So how is this knowledge going to be acquired? Another very important verse in the Bhagavad Gita, by long prostration, pranipatena, by intense questioning, pariprashnena, by serving, savior, to whom, to the wise who have gained this knowledge and will instruct you in this knowledge. So remember, this knowledge can be acquired, and it needs to be acquired because it is such a subtle knowledge that we need to acquire it through somebody who has already gained this knowledge and is willing to instruct us, because we are this seeker who is looking to realize the truth, that by long prostration, intense questioning, and serving, we can attain this knowledge. And there is no greater purifier of the me and the mind, pavitram, than knowledge itself. The yogi, living in the spirit of sacrifice, finds it in his own self. So this is the renunciation of action in knowledge. And going further, he says, knowledge, sacrifice, and the sword of knowledge, and having renounced actions by yoga, having destroyed all doubts by knowledge, having centered in the self, you will not be bound by any action. Freedom in action, centered in knowledge. Okay. And this is where he begins to then take us further on. And remember the diagram I've shown you before: knowledge, practice, transformation, selfless action, knowledge of the self, self-realization, Karma Yoga, Jnana Yoga, Jnana Nishtha. So Jnana Nishtha is transformation, reaching the highest truth about ourselves, which is self-realization. And of course, this is the pathway we have followed so far. We will see it becomes more and more elaborate and complex as we go along, as Lord Krishna introduces more and more layers of our being, our sadhana, our techniques which we need to follow. All this are going to be done how? Through our conscious spiritual living. And just to remind ourselves what these 4 A's and 4 B's and 4 C's are, and I'm sure that you're familiar about this now. And this is a good kind of framework within which to think about all your spirituality, and how it is not a matter of just taking time to practice spirituality, but spirituality come into every moment of our life, so that there is no separation between my so-called practical life and so-called spiritual life. Both come together as moment-to-moment spirituality and the practice of spirituality in every moment. And this is how we can do it, by conscious spiritual living. So whatever we are learning here, that becomes the basis on which this is going to be practiced. And again, just to remind ourselves about the method by which we can, or the framework within which we can think about this, from the ego individual to the seeker to the person of wisdom. And I've described this in detail in the last talk. But again, then adding the spirit of sacrifice and action, knowledge, and renunciation, which is meant for that purification, which is eventually going to take us to the realization of the self. Okay, so let's begin looking at chapter number 5 now. And we're going to start by looking at Arjuna's question. So he asked Bhagwan at the very beginning of the chapter, as he does in many chapters. He says, renunciation of action, or Krishna your praise, and again yoga, performance of action. Tell me conclusively that which is the better of the two. So here we got two things, renunciation of action and performance of action. So now in Arjuna's mind, there is a kind of refinement of this thinking, and therefore he has brought this question to Lord Krishna. It sounds familiar. Yes, of course it does, because this is the kind of question he was asking in the beginning of chapter number 3, where he asks, which one is better? Is it karma or buddhi? In other words, when Lord Krishna replies to him, he frames this question in a different way, like he does many times. Is that, okay, you're asking me about karma and buddhi, which implies knowledge. And therefore, I'm going to tell you about Samkhya, which is knowledge. I'm going to tell you about yoga, which is Karma Yoga, and also the final result of this kind of progression from Karma Yoga to the Samkhya Yoga, and to reach the end result of that is that we become established in prajna, which is the Brahmic sthiti, which is also self-realization. So in other words, that, Lord Krishna is replying to Arjuna in chapter number 3 by taking him in the understanding of these 3 important categories of thinking, Samkhya, Yoga, and Brahmic Sthiti, and how these 3 things are related together as a pathway and the ultimate destination, which is to be reached in a certain sequence, which we have already talked about, is that the first part of our journey is purification, which I just kind of shown you in the previous diagram. And then with the purification, we become fit to sit down and meditate. And in that meditation, we can realize the self. So Sankhya and Yoga are not optional to realization. In other words, it's not about, okay, I can either practice this or that. It means that Sankhya for the purified sadhak and Karma Yoga for purification. So there is a category of Sankhyans and there's a category of Karma Yogis, and each one has kind of approached this particular pathway according to the kind of purification which is already there. And in terms of this pathway, first comes purification, then comes quiescence, and the kind of way in which that quiescence is going to lead us to the deepest state of meditation. So Chitta Shuddhi to Jnana Prapti to Jnana Nishtha. This is the process we have been following so far. Okay? Chitta Shuddhi, which is the inner purification, to Jnana Prapti, which means through this purification we begin to get a good grasp of what this knowledge is about. And not only that, we begin to have glimpses of this higher knowledge. And then as we sit down in meditation, in deep absorption of the mind, in this way, which is going to be described to us in the next chapter, then we become established in this knowledge of the self. So Karma Yoga, Jnana Yoga, Jnana Nishtha. Again, to remind ourselves, this is the sequence we have been following so far, but Arjuna's question is different this time. It's not about action and knowledge, but about action and renunciation of action. So how is that to be explained? And here, Shankaracharya explains that action and renunciation of action are both for Chitta Shuddhi. So, in other words, that we are looking at the Ajnani who has now started coming on the path of Karma Yoga, and then there is also the kind of giving up of action, renunciation of action, which is also another approach to this purification. Okay, so then how do we actually go about thinking this particular way of describing the difference between action and renunciation of action? Because if both of them are for chitta shuddhi, and both of them are approached by the person who has not yet realized or who's not a jnani, then who is each one meant for? There must be something which defines or kind of separates out the seeker in terms of the action and in terms of the renunciation of action. So this is the interesting question. Is action is for the ajnani who is purifying his antakarna. Now here is the important thing. Rajas is much greater than sattva. So the balance between rajas and sattva is towards rajas. And for such a person who has come on the spiritual path, the purification will come through karma yoga, action. But renunciation of action is also for the ajnani for purification. But here, there's a difference. Sattva is much greater than rajas. So, people come into this world, they grow up, and at a certain stage, they begin to come onto the spiritual path. And yet, there are people who grow up and immediately go into sannyas. For them, there is no karma yoga to be practiced because the rajas is lower than the quality and the quantity of sattva. And in that case, although he has not yet realized the truth, there is still some purification to be done. And in this case, what happens is the balance between the two is this, is that one has still those desires and attachments which need to be worked through, whereas here is a person who has maybe worked them out in a previous life and therefore is ready to go into the study of the scriptures and contemplation and meditation right from the very beginning. And of course, we have got many, many examples of that. And the idea here is that, and if you remember Bhagwan Ramana Maharshi himself, he had even gone beyond this stage of renunciation of action. For him, there was nothing else to do now, except to get completely absorbed in the truth. So Karma Yoga can be said to be for a householder, Karma Sannyasa for monkhood. And of course, I've got an example in my own household where, my daughter has taken up to this path at a very early age, Karma Sannyasa, that the whole focus is then on contemplation and meditation and study of the scriptures rather than to go through being a householder. So here then we have got a slight differentiation. You remember now I have added another category called Karma Yoga, Karma Sannyasa, Jnana Yoga, Jnana Nishtha. So Arjuna's question is about whether he should leave Karma Yoga and focus on the study and contemplation for purification rather than keep on doing his duty. What do you think Lord Krishna's answer is going to be? And of course, he's going to push him back and say, decisively, what is better for you? Better is Karma Yoga than renunciation of action. Because he knows his friend, he knows Arjuna, he knows that, the Rajasic element is quite strong, and therefore he needs to think about Karma Yoga rather than renunciation of action. So when one starts the journey will depend on the level of Kartatva Bhava and Bhoktatva Bhava. In other words, the doership and the enjoyership. If I have a strong sense of doership and enjoyership, which means my rajas is high, the identification with the body intellect is high, and therefore I have still got attachments towards the objects of the world, which I think is going to give me the enjoyment, then my journey starts with Karma Yoga. But if the Kartatva Bhav and the Bhoktatva Bhav is lower and the sense of identification with the body is not there, then I feel as if, there's nothing for me to do in this world, nothing for me to achieve. I am feeling as if I would rather completely focus on a spiritual life rather than think about all these things. And we find that there are people who are not interested in social things, economic things, other things. They just want to study and to contemplate and to meditate. So if one then begins to think about where am I in terms of this doership and enjoyership, then we can begin to get an idea as to what is the level of my entry. What about you? How long can you study and contemplate before you get tired? For most of us, it's about maybe 1 hour, 2 hours. Even this lecture, towards the end, the mind starts whirling about. Why? Because there are other thoughts on the one hand taking this attention away. There are things which are keeping me occupied in the world of names and forms. There is the focus which is clearly about, let me do this, that, and the other. And therefore, I want to, this is contemplation is fine, but I've got other things to do. And therefore, it is hard to contemplate. And tiredness comes quite easily. So Bhagwan's response then, that is Arjuna's question, Karma Yoga or Karma Sannyasa. So, of course, Bhagwan is going to tell him what? Renunciation of action and yoga of action both lead to the highest, eventually, of course. But the yoga of action is superior to the renunciation of action. And he says, why? Because renunciation, O mighty armed one, is hard to attain without yoga. The yoga harmonized man of steady contemplation soon goes to Brahman. So you can see why he's justifying that, renunciation is not for you, Arjuna. He says renunciation is hard to attain without yoga. Again, bringing in the point that the first starting point for everybody is Karma Yoga, because the Rajas is there and the Sattva is not yet kind of lifted out of its position in terms of greater propensity towards Sattva, and therefore it is hard to attain without yoga. Yoga is required before one can begin to renounce actions in the world. But somebody who is harmonized in this way and becomes steady in the contemplation soon goes to Brahman. That's why he's saying both lead to the highest eventually. The first is the practice of Karma Yoga to reduce doership and enjoyership, purification, increase of Sattva and decrease of Rajas. Then focus on contemplation becomes easy and soon leads to the Brahmanishta. So here you can see this is the logic. Now remember that Arjuna has asked a particular question. Lord Krishna is now explaining to him what this is all about. And he says, for you, Arjuna, I think Karma Yoga is better, because renunciation of action is hard to do unless you have got this purification which has taken place to that extent. And therefore, there is a certain threshold when we begin to say, okay, these things don't attract me anymore. I think I'd rather focus on contemplation and meditation. So who is a perpetual sannyasi? Now, this sannyasi then gives us an idea about what we mean by karma sannyas and what we mean by karma yoga and karma sannyas and what is the relationship between the two. And here Lord Krishna talks about the perpetual sannyasi who neither hates nor desires and is free from the pairs of opposites. So in a sense, he's painting a picture of a karma sannyasi who has reached a stage, but also kind of indicating what lies just beyond that. And in this way, he's saying, this is a perpetual sannyasi. Now, if you think about it, the Lord Krishna is actually giving us a way of how the householder can slowly begin to move towards becoming a sannyasi, even whilst living in a household. Which, like Gurudev says, is very much a novel idea, which is being presented to us by Lord Krishna. And remember that Samkhya and Yoga are not distinct, because he says only children speak of them as different. Establishing in one, you get the fruit of both. So it is going to be practiced in a serial way. Yoga comes first, Samkhya comes after that, after the purification has taken place, so that the threshold allows you to get into contemplative states of the mind, and therefore, they are not distinct in that manner, but they are to be practiced in a serial manner. And if you get established in one, you get the fruit of both. Eventually, of course, as far as Karma Yoga is concerned. The place which is reached by the Sankhyans, the Jnani, is also reached by the Yogi, Karma Yogi. He sees who sees Sankhya and Yoga as one. So think of Sankhya and Yoga as one, which is really the idea that both these things are taking us to the highest truth, but they have to be practiced in a certain manner, in a certain way, in a certain sequence. But of course, like he is saying, that both of these are going to take us to the highest. So then we are going to think about how do we attain this Brahmanishta. So he's going to take us right to the end point and say, look, this is where you are going to go, and this is the journey which is going to take you there. And therefore, Karma Yoga, Karma Sannyasa, Jnana Yoga, and then Jnana Nishta. And this Brahmanishta, Jnana Nishta, of course, the same thing, in the sense that we are talking about the final conclusion of our spiritual journey. So what is the method of becoming Brahmanishta? He says, but renunciation is hard to attain. Though through steady contemplation with the mind that has been purified, one goes to Brahman. Purified mind is what? Single-pointed, still and subtle, and also content, peaceful, and equanimous. Remember, I keep on talking about the purified mind. It has got a certain characteristics which it evolves into. And also that the experience of this subtle purified mind is that you feel more contented, you feel more peaceful, and equanimity is available for you. And though acting is not acting is not tainted by karma and vasana, one established in Brahman is the one who is. So here is somebody who's acting, in other words, carrying out action. But he is not tainted. Tainted means what? That more karmas are developing and more vasanas are created, or the vasanas which are already there, they are being strengthened. And even though acting, one gets established in Brahman, is the one who is devoted to the path of action, whose mind is quite pure, who has conquered the self, subdued his senses, and realizes his own self as a self in all beings. Now, this is the key thing. The key point is the last one, which is the Brahmic city. And this is what we mean by Brahmanishta, is that when one has this direct experience that the self in me is the self in all beings, so that we have transcended the individual names and forms, and we have found a substratum of all of our existence as this self. And realizing this self in myself, I see that this self is also the same self in all beings. So, method is what? Is through steady contemplation, when the mind gets purified, and when that purified mind is there, one gets established in Brahman by these methods. Becoming devoted to the path of action, and the mind gets purified, and with the conquering of the self and the subduing of the senses through this method, then eventually one realizes his self as the self in all beings. So this is the method of becoming Brahmanishta. And then the nature of Jnana-nishta, which is given in the next two verses. And this is the way in which Lord Krishna describes this. He says, I do nothing at all. Thus would be the harmonized knower of the truth. He thinks in this manner, I do nothing. Seeing, hearing, touching, smelling, and it gives this whole list of things which are happening on a moment-to-moment basis, on a daily basis. All this is going on in terms of body, mind, intellect. Everything is going on. And the harmonized knower of the truth, the Jnana-nishta, thinks, I do nothing at all. I'm not doing anything. Seeing is going on, hearing is going on, touching is going on, smelling is going on. But there is a difference between what is going on in my body, mind, intellect, and my center of myself. And this clear distinction and a clear experience of this comes about with this knowledge, that this conviction that the senses move amongst the objects of the senses. Sound familiar? See, Lord Krishna is wonderful at giving the same thing in so many different ways, so that there is no doubt in our mind. So I'm sure you remember that it is the idea which has been given to us in the earlier chapter. So to establish oneself in knowledge, one maintains an attitude and a constant thought of, I am not the doer of any action. This is taking us towards establishing ourselves in the knowledge, so that it becomes a daily kind of attitude and a knowledge which one carries with oneself, saying, I'm not really the doer of any action, but it does not stop you from doing action. It's still, you are doing the action. Everything is going on, but you stand apart. You are not the doer of the action. So remember, doership, enjoyership. Here what is happening? Doership is beginning to diminish. This is Karma Sannyasa, getting disidentified with the action, renouncing them, giving up the sense of doership and enjoyership through a conscious process. So Karma Sannyasa then leads to this way of thinking and being in the world whereby everything is going on, I do nothing at all. And when I get into this mode of functioning, then what happens? I begin to get established in this knowledge. And remember, the 4 A's here are very important, because this is where the awareness is going to come in, alertness that I'm moving out of this consciousness of I do nothing at all, bring me back again and again into this mode of functioning. And with this kind of way of functioning in the world, remember, it's for the Karma Sannyasi, whereby, the sattva is quite strong, so that it doesn't take much effort in terms of distancing oneself from the activities of the body, mind, intellect, and therefore begins to get established in this knowledge. So here are things for you to ponder and to practice. Question is, to what extent am I identified with the action in this moment? Now, this goes to the heart of what we have been talking about, in the sense that what is the level of my doership? How much am I identified with the action which I'm doing at this moment? And what is the thought flow at the moment? Because there is a certain thought flow which is taking place, which is turning my attention towards the action and saying, I am the doer of this action. Can I consciously let go of the idea that I am the doer? And how can I do that? Can I consciously let go of the idea that I'm the enjoyer? Then how can I do that? So this is for each one of us to think about, is that how can I orientate my attitude and my belief in such a way, and I function in my life in this way of disidentifying even from the action. And this is something which we have to work out in our own individual way, but the principle is given to us by Lord Krishna. Remember the principle. The practice will depend on each individual level of, the gunas, the texture of the gunas, the attainment in terms of what we have done so far, and therefore it gives us another step which we have to work on. And here what we can think about is, can I focus on being a witness of all action at all levels? And how am I going to do that? Now, the answers to these questions are already there in what we have discussed so far. And of course, there are further instructions which Lord Krishna gives us throughout the Bhagavad Gita as to how to go about doing this. So then how do I feel when I do this? So getting to the experience of this witness and how I can become the witness. Even at this moment, it might be an intellectual process and taking me towards a non-intellectual process of becoming the witness. This is the path to kind of follow by pondering about these points and putting them into practice. So let's go to another interesting section here, the spectrum of the sadhaka. Different types of sadhaka. Of course, it is, of course, related to what we have been talking about earlier. And this is where we start. And this, if you remember, I talked about it in the earlier chapter number 3 as well. Here's the karmi. He's completely ajnani. He is not interested in even in the spiritual path. He is a karta bhokta. Okay, so here we are talking about doership, enjoyership. Remember, I was saying that, how do you think about this level of doership and enjoyership in your own individual lives? So here's the karmi. Now, karmi has now been inspired to step on the spiritual path, and therefore he becomes a karma yogi. What does a karma yogi do? He starts off by renouncing what? Renouncing the fruit of the action. So effectively, he is saying, or she is saying, that actually I'm giving up the fruit of the action. I'm renouncing the fruit of the action, but I'm still feeling as if I'm the doer. And remember, the two things about Ishwararpan Buddhi and Prasada Buddhi. So this is what the Karma Yogi is following, so that this attachment to the things and the fruit of the action begins to diminish. And as it begins to diminish, we get the Karma Sannyasi, who is a karta, a bhokta, but only to a certain extent. He has not yet fully kind of evolved into the Atmavit or the realized master. But like I was saying, that depending on the proportion of the sattva guna, there will be some things, the duties which are being carried out, but most of the time now, the focus of life turns towards contemplation and meditation. And then there's the Jnana Yogi who has said, okay, yeah, no, this is not for me. I'm actually, going to just focus fully on becoming a karta, a bhokta, and therefore more and more of this is coming about. The sense of enjoyership, doership is decreasing even more through getting well established in knowledge, like we saw in the previous section, and then the Atmavit, the knower of the Atma. And he is completely established in non-doership, non-enjoyership. Okay. So you can see now this is the journey which is taking us towards establishment in the Atman. So to know our true self, this is the pathway. So far, Lord Krishna is describing, and of course, he's going to fill in other gaps as well within this structure. But for the time being, we have to understand it in this manner, from the karmi to the karma yogi, from the karma yogi to karma sannyasi, jnana yogi, and then the realized master. So for us, the question, like I was telling you, that what is the points to ponder on, what is it that we have to practice, is to think about, the kartatva bhava and the bhoktatva bhava, and how do we then go about thinking, well, I am here for the time being, I can, maybe give up some fruit of the action, I can practice karma yoga, not yet ready to say, my complete focus should be on spirituality and spiritual matters. If that is the case, then, karma sannyas is the most appropriate. And once that is done, then you move more and more towards the, non-doership and the non-enjoyership, and you end up become established in the truth. So this is the spectrum. And he says, the one who does actions offering them to Brahman, abandoning attachment, is not tainted by sin, just as the lotus leaf remains unaffected by water on it. Karma yogi, Those who have abandoned attachment perform actions merely by body, mind, intellect, and the senses for purification of the ego, Karma Sannyasi. Then the non-united, unsteady, unbalanced, impelled by desires, attached to fruit of the action is bound, karmi, and mentally renouncing all actions, fully controlled and embodied, one rests happily in the nine-gate city. This is another kind of famous verse in this chapter. Lord Krishna talks about this nine-gate city, in which now the embodied one, the Dehi, is located happily. And this nine-gate city, of course, is the body, neither acting nor causing others to act as well. Atmavid. So he has risen to this level of renouncing completely. And of course, we can think about this as the final journey, the final kind of place which we are going to reach. But of course, in that also, in that category, there are also different kind of stages as well. So this is the progression of the path. Karma Yogi, Karma Sannyasi, Jnana Yogi, and Atmavid. So the points to ponder and practice: how do I understand each one of these stages of the path? How do I experience myself in relation to this? Am I ready for the next stage? How can I refine my sadhana to move further on the path? What can I change? What specific techniques can I use to do this? What can I do this? What can I do this on a daily basis? How can I do this on a daily basis? And what is my experience of using these techniques? There's some typos there, but don't worry. The idea here is to then start thinking about, this kind of pathway and where am I in terms of this development, because it gives us a certain idea. And remember, we can also think about the purified mind. And I mentioned this before, is that if we think about the purified mind and the experience of contentment, the experience of peacefulness, and the experience of equanimity, that if I put myself on a scale of 0 to 10, how do I find myself in terms of contentment? Is it 0 or is it 10? And we can begin to kind of visual picture of where we are in terms of our own spiritual journey. And, this is one way of exploring that where you are in terms of what you should be practicing, and to find the appropriate, techniques which is related to that stage of development. So then this is the kind of section in which Lord Krishna gives a lot of knowledge about the Jnani and the Atmavid. So we can see that Lord Krishna in this chapter is giving us a fuller picture, because he is taking Arjuna through step by step. It's not that he's giving him everything in one go, but he is building on knowledge which has already been given, and building on top of that again, and then clarifying and expanding, expanding in a masterful way, like Lord Krishna is. So in this section, which is about 14 verses, he gives an idea about the Jnani and the Atmavid. And in a cosmic sense, then he gives us an idea about the relationship between the Jiva and Prabhu, Vibhu, which is the Lord. What is the role of the Lord, Prabhu, Vibhu, in relation to the individual? So he says the Lord does not create agency nor actions for the world. In other words, the Lord is not responsible for giving us this agency in the way in which we think that our Lord is going to make me do things. No. The Lord does not create agency nor actions for the world, okay, nor union with the fruit of the action. So in other words, that when I get attached to something, it's not the Lord, but it is another way of thinking about it. The Lord neither takes neither the demerit nor even the merit of any. So sometimes we think, oh Lord, take away all my sins and everything else. Lord does not take anything, but it is nature that acts. So here, Lord Krishna is giving this distinction between Purusha and Prakriti. Remember that the Lord in this case, we are talking about uh, Ishvara. You can think about Ishvara as this, the kind of force, the vitalizing force behind this total universe, and also in the sense of the individual, it is the Chaitanya, the consciousness which is giving sentiency to this individual. But once the sentiency is given, it is the nature that acts. So remember, he was talking about the senses moving amongst the sense objects. And previously he was telling us the gunas moving amongst the gunas. So guna, which is this gunas in relationship to this aggregate called the body, mind, intellect. And the gunas, which are the world around me. So it is the guna, me, acting in the gunas, which is the world. It's all about nature. Lord is not doing anything. He is just giving us the sentiency. So knowledge is enveloped in the ignorance. Thereby, beings are deluded. So delusion comes about because knowledge has gone away. It is tamas which envelops this knowledge, and therefore we become deluded. But to those whose ignorance is destroyed by knowledge of the self, like the sun, to them knowledge will reveal Brahman. So who is the knower of the Atman? Intellect is absorbed in that, their self being that, established in that, and with that as their supreme goal, they go whence there is no return. Once you're there, you are there. There's no return. Their sins are dispelled by this knowledge. This is the knower of the Atman. And who is the knower of the Atman in this case? Going further, explaining who is the knower of this Atman, he says, here's a person who will look with an equal eye upon a Brahmana, endowed with learning and humility, on a cow, an elephant, even a dog, and an outcast. Equal eye. Samadarshan. Samadarshan is this equal eye where everything is flattened out. And how is this flattening taken place? If we imagine that we have got these differences in how we respond to the objects of the world and the people of the world and the Brahman and the cow and the elephant, it is because we have superimposed likes and dislikes on these objects. When the likes and dislikes and the vasanas and everything else is disappeared, then what is the natural consequence of that? Equal eye. Everything is seen as just nature acting in itself, nothing beyond that. And here the mind rests in equality because Brahman is spotless, and indeed it itself is equal. There is no division in Brahman. It is completely equal in that sense, and spotless, which means pure. Therefore, they get established in Brahman. Resting in Brahman with steady intellect and undiluted, the knower of Brahman neither rejoices on obtaining what is pleasant, nor grieves on obtaining what is unpleasant. And with the self unattached to external context, he finds happiness in the self. Engaged in the meditation of Brahman, he attains endless happiness. Endless happiness, which what you and me, we are all looking for, this endless happiness. So this is the knower of Atman. And going further, he says, does not rejoice in the enjoyments that are born of context, are only generators of pain. So, these enjoyments which we take for granted, I enjoy this, I enjoy that music, I enjoy this food, etc. He says these are born of context, are only generators of pain. Remember this similar idea in the Yoga Sutra and the Samkhya philosophy, which says that for the Vivekin, the discerner of the truth, everything is suffering. And therefore, this Atmavit does not rejoice in the enjoyments, the impulse which is born out of desire and anger. If he is able to withstand before death, this is a yogin, he is a happy man. So bringing this idea of desire and anger again, saying all these things are impulses towards action in the world, is born out of desire and anger, and the one who is able to withstand. In other words, this idea of control is coming back. Therefore, starting with control, he gets established in Brahman. And the key to the whole thing of spiritual life, according to the Bhagavad Gita, is control of the senses, control of the mind, control of the intellect, being able to stand apart. Sounds familiar? Right? These are the 9 tools of the toolkit. If those are employed in the way in which it has been prescribed to us, we will for sure get to this end point. The Atman who is happy within, who rejoices within, who is illuminated within, that yogi attains absolute freedom or moksha, himself becoming Brahman. So he has now kind of given us the whole journey, and the yogi who was starting off by Karma Yoga, doing his duty in the way in which it is prescribed and going through this kind of Karma Sannyasa and establishing in the knowledge, Jnana Nishta, and then coming to this point whereby attains absolute freedom, moksha, himself becoming Brahman. So these rishis have obtained this absolute Brahman. So it is not something theoretical which Lord Krishna is saying. These rishis themselves have attained this, whose sins have been destroyed, whose dualities are torn asunder, who are controlled and intent on the welfare of all beings. Some of these things have already been talked about by Lord Krishna in almost all the chapters, and this self-control, dualities going beyond dualities, going beyond likes and dislikes, and functioning according to the welfare of all beings. Absolute freedom is available when we are able to function in this way, and it says this Brahmic bliss exists on all sides for those who are self-controlled ascetics, who are free from desire and anger, who have controlled their thoughts, and who have realized the self. So again, the practices are given, the stages of our journey are given, the kind of things which we have to engage with, experience, so that we can then move towards the realization of the self. So what can we say? Equality of vision, steady intellect, undiluted, constant thought of I am that, because this delusion is I am this. Not getting deluded or to get enlightened means I am that. That is the truth. That is the truth about myself. That is self-knowledge, knowledge of the self. So we need to get into this constant thought of I am that, and stay with that thought and experience that thought in all the ways possible in our awareness. With a steady intellect. The intellect is not going all over the place. Steadily staying with this idea, I am that. Equality of vision, as much as we can develop this equality of vision. Going beyond likes and dislikes. Because every time we express our like and our dislike, what are we doing? We are strengthening our vasanas. We are also validating them. We are not letting go of things. We keep on going round and round the merry-go-round of samsara. Being born, then dying, and being born again. This cycle of birth and death continues because our likes and dislikes are continuing. Okay? So even if you don't think about, this thing is sounding so far away, I can't even imagine this cycle of birth and death. But here now, what do you want to experience? You want to experience this equality, equanimity, this peacefulness, this quietness within the mind. Well, one thing you can immediately begin to do is get beyond the likes and dislikes. And uninterested in external contacts. Of course, this is Karma Sannyasa, whereby, we're not interested in doing this and doing that, contacting this and that, beyond desire and anger, engaged in meditation. And therefore, these are the 6 things which we can look at in terms of our own contemplation and practice. So how do you understand the knower of Brahman and Atman? What are the individual practices that will take you to being Atmavit? And think of ways in which you can begin to incorporate them in your daily life as much as you can. Because these are really something which brings us to the experience of our life day to day. And if we can begin to, experience this in the way in which is being described by Lord Krishna, then we begin to move on our spiritual journey in this way. So now the final two verses, which I'm just going to touch on, and then we'll talk about the homework. So besides all the things which I've been mentioning about, what to contemplate, what to practice, of course, then there is some things which we need to also think about in terms of the next month, what you're going to do. So remember that Lord Krishna has been talking in response to Arjuna's question, whether it is karma, yoga, or karma sannyas. And therefore, Lord Krishna is kind of, never gives that direct answer, yeah, this, that, and the other, because then he can finish in two verses. But what he does, and what the good teacher does, is to bring out the framework within which these ideas are located. And when that is done, our knowledge expands so that within that larger framework of thinking, we can begin to know how this is, what the categories are of thinking. So he's already given us so many categories: karmi, karma yogi, karma sannyasi, jnana yogi, and atmavit. So all these categories, he has framed this particular answer to Arjuna's question in these categories and says, look, I know what you are asking, but think about why this is important, that Karma Yoga is better for you than Karma Sannyas, because I want to explain to you in depth as to why this is what needs to be done. And within the bigger picture, this is how it fits into the whole journey towards the realization of the self. And, this Lord Krishna, to me, is really the masterful teacher. If you want to know how to teach something, listen to Lord Krishna, see how he explains, see what he does, see how he takes him point by point, and within this huge philosophy of the Bhagavad Gita, how he gets this knowledge to us so clearly in the way in which he does to Arjuna. So not only is my favorite psychologist, but he's also my favorite teacher. And these two things are very important for me as well. So coming to the basis of meditation. So remember that Lord Krishna always introduces us to the next chapter towards the end of the previous chapter. And in this case, he's going to introduce us to the technique of meditation. So this is beginning dhyana yoga. This is the next chapter on meditation, dhyana. So what is the technique? And it simply gives us the technique here in a general way, which says shutting out all external contexts, which is, remember in Patanjali's Yoga Sutra, when he talks in Ashtanga Yoga, he talks about yam, niyam, and then he talks about asana and pranayam. And the fifth one is pratyahar. Pratyahar is now the kind of connecting link between the external practices of, the asana and the pranayam, and the internal practice of dhyana, dharana, and samadhi. So shutting out all external contexts is like not about, closing off your eyes and ears. There is a way in which the mind can begin to take its attention away from the external context and focus inwards in such a way that the outer world, whether it exists or not, becomes irrelevant. Shutting out all external contexts. In this case, of course, we begin by closing our eyes and focusing on our breathing, etc., etc. But really, the point is that I'm taking my attention away from everything else. And in the ordinary way of living, our attention is always where? It is in the outside world and the objects of the world, because my vasanas are pushing me towards the objects of my desire. The vasanas are pushing me towards the things which I like and taking my attention towards those things which I'm interested in, which I give significance to. And when I give significance to something, then my mind will go towards that. So shutting off all external contexts It says fixing the gaze as though between the eyebrows. Okay? So in other words, that the gaze is also becoming still. So not only is the mind becoming focused and still, but the gaze is also becoming focused and still. I've explained this many times and taken you through the practice of this kind of meditation in the meditation workshops. And it is a very systematic process which Lord Krishna is describing to us, by which we can get into this very subtle states of inner consciousness. And then equalizing the outgoing and the incoming breath, moving within the nostrils, breathing in, breathing out. Equalizing them means that equal attention is being paid to the incoming and the outgoing breath, and also that they become equalized in terms of the pranic energies which are flowing through the breathing process. So equalizing the outgoing, incoming breath with the senses, mind, and intellect ever controlled. Senses are being controlled, mind is being controlled, intellect is controlled. Why? Because I want to take my attention and absorb it in what I need to absorb it in, which is pure awareness. I can't do that if the mind and the senses and the intellect are all over the place. Now, this can only be done if the purification has been achieved by us through Karma Yoga, through Karma Sannyasa, and through Jnana Yoga practice. Our mind becomes a fit instrument to be able to do this. It's not easy to do this unless the mind is purified. And therefore it becomes important for us to recognize how this is to be done. There is a certain pathway to follow. There are certain techniques to be used. And these are the list of things which Lord Krishna is directing Arjuna's attention towards before he starts expounding on the idea of meditation. Shutting out external context, fixing the gaze between the eyebrows, as it were, equalizing the outgoing, incoming breath, moving through the nostrils with the senses, mind, intellect control, and the purpose is having liberation as its supreme goal. We're not doing this for anything else. We want to reach the supreme goal, and therefore that is the goal I'm looking forward to, free from desire, fear, and anger. Okay? And the sage is very liberated forever. So this is Dhyana Yoga. And getting into this practice again and again and again, the mind getting absorbed, this mind which has been purified is able to meditate and get absorbed in this awareness. And with that awareness, eventually, of course, the sage is liberated forever. And remember, the whole point of this spiritual practice is what? At the level of our thinking about the journey and the end point, we have to think about also self-realization as a means of releasing us from the cycle of birth and death. Moksha, liberated forever. There's no coming back. It's a one-way journey. Once you're there, you're there. There's no coming back to ego identity, because the very seeds which give rise to the ego individuality in this life or the next life, those are completely gone. So liberated forever. What is the result? Knowing me as the enjoyer of sacrifice in the austerities, the great Lord of the worlds, the friend of all beings, he attains peace. So it's not that Lord Krishna is advertising himself. He's just saying this very important point, that the self in me is the self in you. That the underlying substratum of all existence, including this totality of creation, Ishvara, is the substratum of Brahman. The great Lord of all worlds means that he is the controller of this totality of creation. He is the friend of all being, and he attains peace. This is what is the result. And what will you do now? This is the homework. Listen, read, and reflect on the content of chapter number 5. As I said, it is lot of work for you to do, because this is just a presentation. And based on this presentation, take up the Bhagavad Gita of Puja Gurudev, go through it again and again, read the commentary, read what we have discussed about today, and show that you understand the relationship between Karma Yoga, Karma Sannyasa, reflect on your own experience and life in relation to these two ideas. Why is it important? Because it determines what you are supposed to be doing in your sadhana. Reflect upon the techniques of which Bhagwan talks about in this chapter. Reflect on these and think of how you can incorporate them into your own life. And what is the key idea in this chapter, and how do you rate yourself on these? Tattva bhava, sense of doership. Tattva bhava, a sense of enjoyership. What can you do to reduce these and move from Karma Yoga to Karma Sannyasa? And enjoy the sadhana, stay safe, stay well. So this is what we have covered today. And as I said, this is the basis of your future contemplation for the next month. And as much as you can kind of reflect on this idea, layer by layer we are going. So if you miss one whole layer, then it becomes difficult to grasp the next one. So I urge you that it is living through the Gita. It is about not only knowledge and clarifying this knowledge, but also committing yourself to the practice. And as much as you do this, the truths of the Bhagavad Gita will start flowing through you in this wonderful manner, giving you such joy and happiness, which is beyond anything which you experience in this relation to the world. So thank you very much, and we will get together again next month, first Friday, hopefully. And because maybe still in lockdown, we will continue in this manner. If anything changes, of course, you will be given advice. So we'll conclude with the prayers.
Om Sarve Bhavantu Sukhinah, Sarve Santu Niramaya, Sarve Bhadrani Pashyantu, Ma Kaschit Dukha Bhag Bhavet. Om Asato Ma Satgamaya, Tamaso Ma Jyotirgamaya, Mrityorma Amritam Gamaya. Om Purnamada Purnamidam Purnat Purnamudachyate Purnasya Purnamadaya Purnameva Vashishyate. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Harihi Om. Shri Guru Pyo Namaha. Harihi Om. Om na tatra suryo bhati na chandra tarakam nema vidyuto bhanti kuto yamagnihi tameva bhantam anubhati sarvam tasya bhasa sarvamidam vibhati. Boliye Shri Sadgurunath Maharaj ki jai. Hari Om.
Hari Om, everyone.